You are connected, and you are listening to Specifically for Seniors, the podcast for those in the Remember When generation. Today's podcast is available everywhere you listen to podcasts and with video at Specifically for Seniors YouTube channel. Now, here's your host, Dr. Larry Barsh.
It is an honor to introduce our guest on Specifically for Seniors today. Alexander Keyssar is the Matthew W. Stirling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard University. An historian by training, he has specialized in the exploration of historical problems that have contemporary policy implications. His book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, was named the best book in U.S. history by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. Professor Keyssar chaired the Social Science Research Council's National Research Commission on Voting and Elections, and he writes frequently for the popular press about American politics and history. Professor Keyssar's latest book, entitled Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, is published by the Harvard University Press. Welcome to Specifically for Seniors, Alex.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Larry, and it's a pleasure to be here.
With the most likely candidates for president this coming election being two of the three oldest ever to hold office, do you find age a critical factor in the 2024 election?
I think age is an important factor with respect to President Biden. I think that what's one of the things that's interesting about this election, which is, I think, in many respects, a very weird and unprecedented election, at least as it's unfolding at the present, is that there's very little focus on the former president, on Donald Trump's age, because there are so many other features of his experience and personality that seem to trump, if you will, his age as sources of concern. But I think that I certainly think, and the polling suggests this, that the electorate is not really pleased at having a choice between two candidates who are not in the full flush of youth, or not in the bloom of sort of the central parts of their careers, and who have both been around for a while. And I think that there's a kind of public fatigue with them.
And age isn't the only factor that's going to be considered in the election. Many precedents are and will be broken. And let's try to put some of these in historical perspective if we can. We have an incumbent president who has faced controversy about whether his son may have promised favors to business associates. Let's not get into the right or wrong of anything, but has this happened before in our history?
Yes, it has. I mean, I think that that there is a fairly long-standing tendency of relatives of the president trying to capitalize on the fact that they have a relative who's president. I mean, we saw this with Bill Clinton's brother. I think we saw something fairly similar with Jimmy Carter's brother, whose name was, I think, Billy Carter. and they had to be kind of squelched or moved to the sidelines. Uh, I think that this happens, and it's not notably the responsibility of the candidate. And they're also, let's also be clear that corruption in or around uh, the presidency is hardly a 21st century phenomenon. I mean, Warren Harding, who was president in the early 1920s, in effect was compelled to leave the presidency because of corruption, not for him personally, but too much corruption in his cabinet and the people around him. So I think this is a long-standing issue.
And with all the divisiveness in this country, it becomes a preeminent problem.
Well, it becomes the divisiveness seeks to capitalize on it, so that I think, for example, um, when issues came up with Bill Clinton or with Jimmy Carter, the public response in general was to say, we know this isn't really the president's fault, but that this is the kind of thing that happens. They've got to do their best to insulate themselves and the office from this, but it's no big deal. I think that in the current circumstances, not only I think there are two things that are distinctive. One is that the sheer divisiveness, the temperature of our current politics is such that any claim like this is going to be politicized and bandied about regardless of the substance. I mean, for example, I was reading one factoid that two Republican senators 3 months ago said that they had evidence that President Biden himself was implicated in some of his son's untoward financial transactions, but they have come forward with no evidence. And it's been 3 months since then. I think the other dimension is stranger and in its own way more psychologically complicated, which is that to my mind at least, or based on what I've read, there's no doubt that President Trump and his family have benefited financially in very substantial ways from his presidency. You need to look no further than his hotel in Washington, where he required people to stay, or his attempts to have sort of necessary meetings at a hotel that he owns in Florida. His son-in-law's financial arrangements with the Saudis after the presidency, and yet it seems to me that what the former president and his entourage have done is to try to deflect attention away from their own corruption by pointing at Biden and saying, at a minimum, he did it too. I mean, there's a kind of projection, an accusation. Say someone accuses you, or it seems that you are guilty of a certain crime, and you say, no, I didn't really do it, but look at the other guy.
Have we ever faced an election so critical to American democracy?
Well, it's hard to ignore the election of 1860, which the results of which did, catapult us into the Civil War. So I don't want to say it's without precedent. And that election was consequential. Lincoln's victory, more or less, guaranteed, or at least yielded, the secession of the South. Um, but that was not about democracy in the entire country. It was about who was going to be part of the country. A major issue, to be sure, but a somewhat different issue. With that aside, to my knowledge, as a historian, nothing comes close to the significance of this election in terms of the maintenance of democratic institutions in the United States. Um, if indeed it turns out to be an election battle between the president and the former president, My own view is that if the former president were to emerge victorious in this election, um, it would almost certainly result in the dismantling of a number of democratic institutions or institutions designed to protect democratic procedures and democratic processes. So I do think that the future of American democracy is at stake here.
The former president has announced that if he's elected, as you mentioned, he's going to change the entire executive branch of government and make every agency responsible to the president. Has anyone ever attempted this before?
The answer is no. I mean, I think all presidents want to make the executive branch, to the extent that they can, responsive to uh, their own policy preferences and desires. Um, but it's also the case that a great deal of the executive branch has been set up um, in order to provide insulation against that. The regulatory agencies, have career employees at many different levels. Um, and really every branch of the executive has that built in, and that is a check on the whims of any particular president. I think this brings us back to the accusations that were made during his presidency against the quote deep state, where the deep state seemed to be some sinister force operating, outside of the world of elections or legitimacy. The deep state was in effect what in most countries would be called the civil service. It's the people who, as part of their careers, hold jobs with particular expertise and particular know-how about how to get certain kinds of things accomplished within the government. And the deep state includes a number of people with legal training who know what is legal, what is not legal, what is prohibited by ethical rules or other rules. Um, and that's what's being called the deep state. It's in fact not, to my mind, it's not a sinister, dark force in American politics. It is a source of continuity in the conduct of policy, um, and in many respects, a source of ongoing legitimacy for the government itself.
I suppose I can't skip over asking how Donald Trump compares to Richard Nixon.
um, well, I think that Nixon shared something of a contempt for certain political norms. Obviously, what would happen during, around Watergate, and and his Nixon's willingness to, hire extra legal teams to do what, to carry out missions that would guarantee his reelection. Interestingly, and part of what, in terms of overreactions and a kind of paranoia, the fact is that Richard Nixon was overwhelmingly likely to defeat George McGovern in 1972 anyway. He didn't really need the plumbers, uh, but there's something of a paranoid streak about this. Nixon also famously had an enemies list where he tried to use the IRS to punish people who were his uh, political enemies. But Nixon also had, I think, more years of experience in the world of policy and governance. And he was embedded much more in a Republican Party that he did not completely dominate. He was the leading figure of for quite a long time. I mean, I I'm trying to recall the exact names now, but in every presidential election after 1948 and until 1976, in every presidential election except one, Nixon's name was on the ballot as the vice president or vice presidential or presidential candidate. In 52, 56, 60, 68, and 72. He's a dominant figure, but he was also embedded in the party with a certain respect for politics. We have to remember, if we think, for example, as we might, about the number of about former President Trump's complaints about the 2020 election and saying that he really won. Um, the fact is, the 1960 election was really one that could have been challenged, but by Nixon. There was some hanky panky. I mean, there's probably hanky panky on both sides, and it was sort of somewhat unclear. But there was potential reason to fight and challenge, but Nixon has some sufficient conviction in the electoral apparatus or in the institutions that he chose not to do that. And that's certainly not something which former President Trump, that's not a choice that former President Trump made.
Trump's attacks on the press are more dangerous than we've seen before, I think. Is there any historical precedent where a president I know presidents attack the press when they don't like something in it, but has there ever been anything so insidious?
Well, I think that if one takes a long historical sweep, there are two different variables. One is the president and who's president and what they think, and the other is the nature of the press. Um, in the 19th century, and really somewhat into the early decades of the 20th century, the press was always overtly politicized, identifying with parties, identifying with factions of parties, identifying with candidates, um, and uh, you know, but there was also, I mean, in terms of what we think of as the mainstream press, there are also multiple different sources. I mean, I live near the city of Boston. The city of Boston now has two newspapers, and that's been the case for a number of decades. But in 1900, 1910, I think the city of Boston had something like 12 or 14 daily newspapers. Um, and that was fairly typical of a lot of cities. So things were politicized in a kind of uh, rumble tumble way, and the partisanship of the press was not disguised. Now, since World War II or even earlier, we entered into an era uh, of the mainstream press trying to adopt a purely professional, nonpartisan stance. Now, we know that no newspaper is ever completely nonpartisan, and there are leanings, and sometimes there are differences between editorial boards and the reporters, as is the case, for example, with the Wall Street Journal. Um, but there has never been attacks on the press during this modern era, um, and I mean, it's really attacks on truth. It's attacks on evidence. It's attacks on logic, um, and trying to discredit institutions which do most of the time try to make a fair-minded assessment of the facts and to just try to discredit them. I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I do, for example, I mean, I am not surprisingly, given who I am, I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, and then, and I watch CNN and MSNBC, but I do also watch Fox News with some frequency, and it's very striking, the different universes that are portrayed. Um, and I think that the attacks on the press are without precedent. There, look, what's being attacked now in different parts of the country is not just the press; it's books, right? Can you assign books to kids? I yesterday, one school district in Florida is not allowed to assign the entire text of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Not to mention a lot of much more modern and political books, which have been effectively banned in Florida. So the attacks on the press are attacks on the notion that there is such a thing as truth and accuracy, and that's without precedent and pretty dangerous.
You just don't see an attempted dismantling of the press in democracies.
No, but you see it. Um, you see the dismantling of the press and the attacks on the press as kind of standard operating procedures in states or governments which are sliding away from democracy into some form of authoritarian rule. I mean, you see that, for example, in Turkey over recent decades, where yes, Erdogan has been elected, and that's true, um, but he has also gradually over decades eliminated most of the free press. You see that in Hungary, the same thing. This, the playbook of obviously it's true in Russia after a brief period of opening, but two of the standard moves in the emergence of authoritarian rule are attacks on the press, and not just verbal attacks. Basically preventing parts of the press from operating and operating freely, and attacks on the judiciary. That's the second part of it. And then the two become linked, because if you have a captive judiciary, then lawsuits by the press saying they should have been closed are not going to be heard. Um, and those really do look, if you look comparatively, those are standard moves, and that is really what um, those are moves contemplated by the right wing of the Republican Party.
What's the historical importance of an indicted former president running for reelection, not only to this country, but to the rest of the world?
I it's an interestingly phrased question. Um, I think to the rest of the world, or to much of the rest of the world, it looks like one more sign that American democracy is in or near, I wouldn't say collapse, but is in difficulty. Um, I think it's also a sign of the disrespect of the judicial system, which has already become quite prominent in the United States, as it is in some authoritarian countries. The fact is that if you back up into the ancient world of 30 or 40 years ago, which you and I are old enough to remember, as adults. Um, I think that's if someone had been indicted for a crime, you would have presumed that they would not run for office while under indictment, because you would presume that the judicial system had some measure of fairness and accuracy in the way it was proceeding. Now, an indictment is not a conviction. If somebody were indicted and then found to be not guilty, then they can run for office, and that has happened in the past. Not for president, but it has happened for other offices. In this case, what seems to be happening is that the presence of indictments, plural, does not seem to tarnish the candidate or the candidacy in any way for a large percentage of the population. And I think that has to mean that they are expressing um, a disrespect or a lack of confidence in the judicial system.
And not only that, using it in their speeches and campaign advertisements.
Absolutely, and there again, one sees projection going on, that they're accusing the Biden Justice Department of doing what they have said they would do if they were in power. Attacking. If you think of who has been running the special counsel investigation, Jack Smith, who seems to be as much of a straight arrow as you could find anywhere, and who, by all accounts, if he ever had a party registration, it was as a Republican. And Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, who is also, a complete straight arrow, very cautious attorney. So, to accuse that group of being engaged in partisan vendettas is really a stretch.
And despite the indictments, lies, and threats, the Republicans remain staunchly supportive of Trump. Has this extreme loyalty ever occurred historically in a democracy?
I hesitate to say it has never occurred. It's always hazardous to say it has never occurred. There are, if you look comparatively, and then countries which you think may not be democracies, but there are multiple examples of leading political figures who retain the passionate loyalty of a part of the population, no matter what they've done or what they have been accused of. I think, for example, of Juan Perón in Argentina, who went from being a populist dissident to being elected to being maybe somewhat corrupt, etc. But Perón has been dead for decades, but the Peronist Party is still, is still there, and certainly as long as he was alive or his wife was alive, there was tremendous, personal loyalty there. There was loyalty in Italy to Berlusconi, and there still is. He still wields some power, even though he's been out of office for a long time. So I think that there are examples of this kind of loyalty that, to our minds, is being preserved beyond the limits of evidence. But politics and political support is not a matter of it's a matter of emotions and psychology as well as rationality. People support and remain loyal to candidates for reasons that are other than simply checking the boxes about what policies they agree with or not. There are emotional factors here, and I think they play a large role.
Now, an easy question.
Oh, good.
Will American democracy survive?
That is an easy question. I think the most honest answer I can give is that I don't know. I don't know. And the fact that I feel like I don't know bothers me. You and I grew up not having that question in mind for most of our lives, and it not being really a question. Even remember the electoral crisis of the 2000 election when Gore had won the popular vote and the dispute over 537 votes in Florida. But we didn't think that democracy would teeter, at that point. Right now, I don't. I honestly, do not know if American democracy will survive. I think that we have a problem in that we have a two-party system. We've had a long-standing two-party system, which itself, frankly, I think is part of the problem. But we have a two-party system, and one of the parties, I think, no longer believes in or adheres to the institutions of American democracy. I don't say that about everybody in the Republican Party, but clearly there's a large enough segment of that party that um, you know that I think that uh, you know that the future of American democracy does hang in the balance. I mean, reflecting on this and free associating a little bit, if we think about the immediate aftermath of what happened on January 6, 2020, um, there was a moment when numerous leaders of the Republican Party, um, including the current Speaker of the House and the current sort of Republican leader in the Senate, and many others, stood up and said, "This has gone too far. We can't take this." You know, members of the cabinet resigned. I mean, it was a way of saying, this is beyond the limits. We will stick with protecting the institutions rather than with protecting the person. Um, and that looked to me like a moment when the survival of American democracy was being reassured and was being, and the prospects were being strengthened. And then, as you know, and listeners know, within a period of about 3 or 4 weeks, there was a rapid flight from precisely those stances by precisely those leaders, with the exception of people like Liz Cheney. Um, and I think that was a moment when the leadership of the Republican Party was saying loyalty to Mr. Trump and the preservation of our own political careers is more important than the preservation of democratic institutions. And I think that remains where we are today.
I mentioned your books at the start, The Right to Vote and Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College. Where are they available for listeners who might be interested?
You can certainly. I appreciate this. That they should be pretty widely available. They're both in paperback now. Um, Amazon carries them. So does my God, I'm forgetting the name. The, there's a website of books something which I prefer to Amazon. It's a sort of network of independent bookstores, um, and I don't know why the precise title of the website is escaping me. But if you were to do a Google search for independent bookstores or books.com or something, you would find it.
Did we miss anything about challenges this country is facing politically? Anything else you'd like to comment on?
I guess the one I guess one thing which needs to be added into the backdrop, and I'm not quite sure how it plays out, is that this drama taking place within the American political world, or maybe there are a couple of things that need to be mentioned here. One is that we haven't mentioned race, and race obviously is playing a role in what's going on in domestic politics in the United States, and we can't back away from recognizing that. It's both, race and reactions to racial issues and ethnic issues, and that is part of the story. The other dimension, which I had wanted to allude to, is that we inhabit the United States, we the people of the United States inhabit a changing international world. This is not uh, simply the post World War II world. It's not the Cold War. People have talked about it as Cold War 2.0. I'm not quite sure there's a 2.0, but I'm not sure that the global arena is stable, or that there is as universal sympathy with democratic institutions as there may once have been. Um, so I think that I think that this is all playing out in a world where, in terms of social, ethnic, and international divisions, it's a fairly hazardous time, and we, to the extent that any of us want to take action to try to ameliorate things in the United States, we have to recognize that the global climate makes that kind of amelioration all the more urgent.
Alex, thank you. This was an honor, a privilege, and an education. Thanks for being on Specifically for Seniors.
Well, again, it's thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, really, and an honor for me. And as a senior myself, I'm particularly interested in addressing an audience of my peers.
Thanks again, Alex.
Thank you.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. We'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.